Hello, and welcome back to me reading Halloween books. I'm going to put a timestamp down below for when I actually start reading if you don't care about my waffling. But I just wanted to say this is the Hocus Pocus 1993 original novelization movie tie-in by Todd Strasser. And the novelization is by Todd Strasser. And a couple years ago, there was a hardcover book that came out. It's purple. It's by A.W. Jantha, and it's Hocus Pocus and an all-new sequel. And I have not read their version of the Hocus Pocus novel, but I did read the sequel, and it was fine. But there will also be coming out, let me see when exactly, an illustrated version that comes out August 30th. That's illustrated by Chris Grimley, one of my favorite illustrators. Sorry if you can hear my cats running around there. They've lost their minds. There's a piece of bubble wrap with masking tape on it that they're going crazy. They're going crazy for it. But yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of a backstory. But this one is the original 1993 one that came out alongside the film. And Disney used to do that. I don't know that they still do, but I also have an Alice in Wonderland one that came out when the Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland, which not so great, I don't think. Had higher hopes for it. Love the White Queen though. Anne Hathaway looked phenomenal. Anyway, this is the original novelization from 1993, and I'll post the cover in the thumbnail, but it has a screenshot from the film. It's not even like promotional stills. It's literally just a random screen grab, and it's funny because it's kind of blurry. Bette Midler is in focus, but the others are not. It's so funny that it was like just kind of slapped on there. But this originally cost $2.95, so I don't think it was too serious. I certainly paid more than that for it, unfortunately. But anyway, let's get started. Prologue, Salem, Massachusetts, October 31st, 1693. In the dim light before dawn, a door creaked somewhere in the house, where 15-year-old Thackeray Binks and his family slept. Thackeray's eyes burst open as the faint sound of cackling laughter floated in through the window. He turned and looked at the small wooden bed where his 7-year-old sister Emily slept. The bed was empty. Thackeray instantly sensed that something was wrong. Emily never liked to get out of bed on cold fall mornings. Besides, her dress and underclothes were still hanging by the hearth. She wouldn't have gone outside in her bedclothes. Thackeray quickly got up. He had reason to be concerned. The day before, Emily had eaten a candy crow, and since, she had behaved oddly, as if she was in a daze. Thackeray sometimes found his little sister annoying, but just the same, he was worried about her. Pushing open the front door, Thackeray looked outside. The sky was gray and the air was cool and moist. The grass was covered in a silvery film of dew. Suddenly he saw a sight that sent a shiver deep through him. Emily, wearing a nightgown and a sleeping cap, was following a caped figure up the hill toward the house where the 3 Sanderson sisters lived. "Emily!" Thackeray shouted, and started to run after her. He'd heard rumors about the Sanderson sisters. Some people claimed they'd heard strange chants coming from within the house. Others insisted they'd heard children's screams. It was even whispered that the 3 reclusive sisters might be witches. "Emily, stop!" Thackeray cried, but neither his sister nor the caped figure looked back. As he ran after them, Thackeray now saw another chilling sight. Strange purple smoke started to twist and curl from the chimney of the Sandersons' house. Thackeray feared it could mean only one thing, that inside a spell was being cast. He raced through the woods and underbrush. Branches and thorns tore at his nightshirt, but he didn't dare slow down. As he drew closer to the house, he saw Emily being beckoned inside by a bent, hooded figure wearing a blood-red cape. Then the door slammed shut behind them. A water wheel turned and splashed beside the house. The purple smoke rising from the chimney now took the shape of demons and beasts. As Thackeray scrambled closer, his heart began to beat hard with terror, but he knew there was no time to turn back and get help. He reached the house and peered through a small window into a large room lit by candles. A black cauldron hung boiling in the fireplace, and many rows of small glass bottles lined the walls. In the center of the room, 3 old hags dressed in black huddled around Emily. Thackeray gasped and stepped back from the window. Suddenly, an old nail in the water wheel caught his nightshirt and lifted him into the air. Scared almost witless, Thackeray flailed silently as he rose higher and higher. Then his eyes found the sloping roof of the house, and he grabbed it, pulling his nightshirt free. Moments later, Thackeray climbed through an open window on the second floor and crawled onto a loft overlooking the large candlelit room. He saw that 2 of the old hags had moved closer to the cauldron, and one of them was reading from a thick book. The third hag held Emily, who was strangely still. Watching her, Thackeray felt his stomach churn with helpless fear. "Ah, here it is," the hag with the book cackled, pointing at a page with one of her bony fingers. "The life potion." While she read the recipe, the other witch added the necessary ingredients: a dead man's toe, some newt saliva, several drops of poison ivy. Thackeray watched in stunned amazement. Any doubts he'd had about the Sanderson sisters being witches now vanished. "One final item and all is done," said the witch with the book. "Add a piece of thine own tongue." Without hesitation, she bit down on her tongue. Blood spurted from her mouth, and she spit the piece of tongue into the cauldron. Frozen with fear, Thackeray watched the bubbling brew inside suddenly foam and change colors. "'Tis ready," the witch cried with delight, dipping a wooden spoon into the cauldron and then offering it to Thackeray's sister. "One drop of this and her life will be ours." Before Thackeray could react, Emily swallowed the potion. Thackeray's eyes went wide. "No!" he shouted and jumped down from the loft, knocking over the boiling cauldron. "A boy!" one of the witches cried. Thackeray ran to Emily, but before he could reach her, the witch with the book aimed her gnarled fingers at him. Zap! A mysterious force struck Thackeray and knocked him to the floor, leaving him stunned. Meanwhile, the witches turned back to Emily, who had begun to glow. "'Tis her life force," said the witches. "The potion worked. Take my hands, dear sisters. We shall share her." As Thackeray watched helplessly from the floor, the witches drew close to one another and inhaled. The glowing light left Emily in 3 streams, each stream entering one witch's mouth. Thackeray gasped as Emily's golden hair turned thin and gray and her skin wrinkled. At the same time, the witches began to grow younger. One pulled back her hooded cape to reveal long golden locks of hair. "I am beautiful," she cried in delight. "Boys will love me." The others also turned younger, but not enough to satisfy themselves. "I will be younger still," muttered the one witch with red hair as she stared at herself in a mirror. "Once I've sucked the life out of all the children in Salem." "All the children?" The thought released Thackeray from his daze. "Hag!" he shouted angrily at the red-haired witch. "There are not enough children in the world to make thee young and beautiful." The red-haired witch spun and fixed a steely glare on him. "Hag, did you say? You will pay for that insult." She snapped her fingers, and Thackeray watched in amazement as her spellbook flew across the room to her. It opened it by itself and flipped through its own pages. "Aha!" the red-haired witch smiled cruelly. "Your punishment will not be to die, but to live forever with the guilt of not being able to save your sister." She began to chant. "Twist the bones and bend the back. Trim him of his baby fat. Give him fur, black as black, just like this. He is a cat." Chapter 1, Salem, Massachusetts, October 31st, 1993. Only moments after Winifred Sanderson turned Thackeray Binks into a black cat, Miss Olin told the sophomores in the darkened classroom. The front door of the house crashed down, and villagers carrying pitchforks and wooden crosses rushed in and took the witches prisoner. At his desk, halfway down the third aisle, 15-year-old Max Dennison rested his chin in his hand. He couldn't believe this teacher had turned off the lights to tell this dumb ghost story. Later, the Sanderson sisters were hanged by the Salem townsfolk, Miss Olin said, but not before Winifred Sanderson promised that one Halloween, when the moon was full, she and her sisters would be brought back to life and would steal the lives of all the children in Salem. Who cares? Max thought miserably. He still couldn't believe that his parents had decided to move to Salem from California. They said they did it for his sister Danny and him, but who were they kidding? If his parents really cared about them, why did they drag them 3,000 miles away from all their friends? "And there are those who say that on Halloween night a black cat still guards the old Sanderson house," Miss Olin went on, warning off anyone who might bring the witches back to life. An eerie silence descended over the classroom as the kids took in the story. "Boo!" Miss Olin suddenly shouted. "Ah!" Half the kids in the room screamed. "Scared you?" Miss Olin laughed and flicked on the lights. "Works every year." Max looked around at his breathless classmates and rolled his eyes in disbelief. "Give me a break," he muttered. Suddenly, Miss Olin turned and stared at him. "So we have a skeptic in our midst," she said with a smile. Mr. Dennison, perhaps you'd like to share your fresh California point of view with us. Max felt the eyes of the entire class on him. He turned and gazed across the aisle at Allison, an incredibly pretty girl with long brown hair and a slim, turned-up nose. Max gave her a slight smile and turned back to Miss Olin. Okay, he said. Granted, you guys in Salem are all into black cats and witches and stuff, but everyone knows Halloween was invented by the candy companies. It's just a conspiracy to sell more candy. Max grinned, quite pleased with his explanation, but the rest of the class just stared blankly at him. Max felt his grin evaporate. Suddenly, Allison cleared her throat. It just so happens that Halloween is based on the ancient feast called All Hallows' Eve, she said. According to the legend, it's the one night of the year when spirits of the dead can return to walk among the living. Max had a sudden idea and quickly jotted his phone number in his notebook. He tore out the page and handed it to her. Well, if Jimi Hendrix turns up tonight, here's my phone number. Ring! The school bell rang, and the kids started to gather their things. Happy Halloween, Miss Olin called. Max picked up his books. He hoped to talk to Allison, but she raced out of the room ahead of him. Oh, Max, Miss Olin said as he walked toward the door. Yes, Max said. When you see Mr. Hendrix, please tell him I said hello. Miss Olin winked at him. Max gave her a look as if she were crazy and left. It wasn't easy being the new kid at school, especially a new kid who'd started almost 2 months late. At the end of the day, Max stepped out of the building and looked around at the groups of kids talking excitedly about their Halloween plans. Max had no plans. He stood for a moment at the top of the steps, gazing at the brilliant orange, red, and yellow leaves on the trees. Suddenly, Allison passed by him. She was wearing a black cape and carrying a large ceramic bowl. Hey, Allison! Max hurried down the steps to catch up to her. Allison stopped and turned to him. Oh, it's you, she said. Look, Max said. I didn't mean to shoot you down before. You didn't? Allison studied him without expression. It was hard for Max to know what she was thinking. He figured he'd better say something nice. It's a nice bowl, he said. Thank you. I made it in pottery shop. My name's Max Dennison. I know, said Allison. You just moved here from California. Last week, Max said. Salem must be a big change for you, Allison said. That's for sure. You don't like it here? Well, the leaves are nice, Max said, but all this witch stuff. He shook his head. You don't believe in it? Allison smiled mysteriously. Stuff like the Sanderson sisters? Max shook his head. No way. The smile on Allison's face grew a little bigger. Not even on Halloween? Especially not on Halloween, Max said. Allison reached into her pocket and handed Max a folded piece of paper. Trick or treat, she said, and walked away. Max unfolded the paper. It was the note with his phone number that he'd given Allison in class. Boy, I really blew that, he thought. Max got his bike and started to ride home. He was really depressed. He missed his old friends, and now he'd just blown his chance with Allison. As he rode past the old graveyard, he didn't even notice the 2 guys on the sidewalk ahead. Halt! One of them said, lifting his hand. Max looked up and hit the brakes. He felt a shiver as he saw who had stopped him. One guy was scrawny with long, greasy blonde hair that fell over his shoulders. The other was bigger and wore an 8-ball jacket. His hair was cut short. Just that day, Max had seen them both sitting outside the principal's office on suspension. Who are you? The scrawny kid asked. Max, I just moved here. From where? Los Angeles, Max said nervously, wishing he'd taken another route home. Dude, the scrawny kid said mockingly. Tubular, said the big guy with a nasty grin. I'm Jay, said the scrawny kid, and this is Ernie. Ernie punched Jay hard in the arm. How many times I gotta tell you? My name ain't Ernie no more. It's Ice. Ernie turned his head around, and Max saw that ice had been shaved into his hair. Correction, Jay said, rubbing the sore spot on his arm. This is Ice. Nice to meet you, Max lied. He started to go past them, but Jay blocked his way. Let's have a bud, he said. I don't smoke, Max said. They're very health conscious in L.A., Ernie said with a smirk. How about some cash, Jay said, holding out his hand. You got any money on you, Hollywood? Max shook his head. Ernie looked disappointed. Geez, no smokes and no money, he said. What am I supposed to do with my afternoon? You could learn to walk without scraping your knuckles, Max suggested. It probably wasn't the best thing to say. Jay frowned angrily and stared down at Max's new sneakers. His frown became a grin. Whoa, new cross trainers, he said. Cool, let me try 'em on, said Ernie. Later, guys, Max said quickly and tried to ride away, but Jay grabbed the handlebars of his bike and stopped him. Hey, Hollywood, didn't you hear what I said? He asked. He wants to try the shoes, dude. A little while later, Max rode down the street toward his new house. It was actually an old ship captain's house with a view of the bay. His parents planned to restore it in their spare time. Max parked his bike and patted in his socks through the front door. In his living room, his parents were unpacking boxes from their move. Hi, Max, how was school? His mother asked in a cheerful voice. It sucked, Max muttered. Hey, language, Mr. Dennison said sternly. Can't believe you made me move here, Max glared at them. His parents gave each other a glance, then looked back at Max. "What happened to your shoes?" his mother asked. "Don't ask." Max turned to the stairs and climbed them 2 at a time. He had to go up 2 flights of stairs to get to his room, which was at the top of the house. Outside his door were signs that said, "Max only," and "Keep out." At least Max had gotten his room the way he liked it. It was a mess. Clothes, CDs, and magazines were all over the place. Max went to his desk, pulled out a bag of chocolate chip cookies, and sat down on his bed. What a miserable day, he thought as he ate a cookie. He didn't know anyone at school, those mutants Jay and Ernie had taken his new sneakers, and he'd made a fool of himself with Allison. Allison. Just the thought of her filled Max with yearning. If only he could touch her long brown hair. If only he could hold her in his arms. Max put down the bag of cookies and picked up his pillow. "Oh, Allison," he said, softly caressing his pillow. "You're so soft and beautiful." Suddenly his closet door swung open, and his 7-year-old sister Danny leapt out. She had straight black hair and was wearing chicken bone earrings, pointy glasses, and a ratty old fur stole. "Ha ha 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 ha!" She cackled like a witch, then pointed a finger at him. "I scared you, I scared you." Max rolled his eyes. Danny was the biggest pain in the world. "Why are you dressed like that?" "I'm a witch," Danny said, climbing onto his bed. She pressed her face close to his and puckered her lips. "Kiss me, I'm Allison." "Drop dead." Max turned away. "Don't be such a crab," Danny said, taking a cookie from the bag. "Guess what? You're taking me trick-or-treating." "No way," Max shook his head. The last thing he wanted to do was have everyone see him taking his little sister around. "Mom says you have to." "Let her take you," Max said. "She can't. She and Dad are going to a party at the town hall." "Then go trick-or-treating by yourself," Max said. "You're old enough." "I can't," Danny said. "I've never done it here before. I'll get lost. Besides, it's a full moon tonight. The weirdos will be out." Max rolled his eyes and pulled the bag of cookies away from her. Danny came close again and put her arm around his shoulder. "Come on, Max. Can't you forget about being a cool teenager for one night? We used to have so much fun trick-or-treating together. It'll be like old times." "Forget it, Danny. The old days are dead." The corners of Danny's mouth turned down, and she jumped off the bed. "I don't care what you say," she yelled angrily. "You're taking me." Bang! Danny ran out of the room and slammed the door behind her. Max shook his head wearily. Why couldn't they have just left her back in California? About 20 minutes later, there was a knock on Max's door, and Mr. Dennison poked his head in. "Come on, Max," he said solemnly. "Let's take a walk." Max knew he was in trouble. He followed his father down the stairs, out of the house, and down to the bay. Hundreds of sailboats and cabin cruisers were moored in the harbor. Max picked up a flat stone and skimmed it over the water. Mr. Dennison started his lecture. "We moved here so that you and Danny could live in a safe, clean environment," he said. "If it's so safe and clean, why can't Danny go trick-or-treating by herself?" Max asked. "Because she's only 7 years old, Max." "Well, I'm 16, Max said, skimming another rock. "Nobody my age goes trick-or-treating." "First of all, you're 15, his dad said. "Second, Danny's really counting on you. Why don't you bring a friend along?" "Because all my friends are in California." "What about this girl Allison?" Mr. Dennison asked. "I hear you're crazy about her." Max stared at him in shock. Then he looked back at the house. He clenched his fists and wished he could kill his little sister. "I can't believe she told you." She blabs her fat mouth, and then you expect me to take her trick-or-treating? Forget it. No way. Now it's totally out of the question. Max's father crossed his arms. "Well then, I guess getting your learner's permit is out of the question too." Max felt his jaw drop. "That's unfair. Totally unfair." "Hey, I never told you life was fair," his father said. "Now suit up." "What are you talking about?" Max gasped. "Danny wants you to wear a costume." Talk about adding insult to injury. Max stared at his father. "You're kidding, right?" "Nope." Mr. Dennison stared back toward the house. "And don't do anything to scare her, Max. She'll get nightmares." "Great," Max shouted at him. "She just gets nightmares and I'm living one." Max spent the rest of the afternoon in his room listening to Ozzy Osbourne and Megadeth. As soon as it started to get dark, he looked out his window and saw groups of costumed little kids being led from house to house by their parents. It was totally humiliating to think that soon he and Danny would be joining them. "Come on, Max," he heard his father call from downstairs. "It's time to go." Max put on sunglasses and a baseball cap and went downstairs. Maybe he was going trick-or-treating, but he wasn't going in costume. Inside the front door, his mother was putting bright red lipstick on Danny's lips. Max's sister was now wearing an orange and black witch's costume with a traditional pointy black hat. "Can't you look happy?" Mr. Dennison asked him. "No," Max replied. His father frowned. "What are you supposed to be anyway?" "A rap singer," Max said. "Shouldn't you wear your hat sideways?" "No." Mrs. Dennison opened the front door. Danny picked up a candy sack and hurried out. "Have fun," her mother called. "Watch out for cars." Max paused in the doorway, dreading what would come next. His father put a hand on Max's shoulder. "Go on," Mr. Dennison said, gently pushing him out, "and don't forget about what we talked about." "It's blackmail," Max thought as he stepped outside. Suddenly he looked up and noticed the full moon. He wasn't sure he'd ever seen it look so big and bright before. He tried to remember what Miss Olden had said. If the moon was full on Halloween, those witch sisters could come back. He shook his head. What a bunch of rubbish. Coming? Danny asked. Yeah, Max joined Danny on the sidewalk. They started down the street. Max had to admit that he'd never seen pumpkins so ornately carved. Some houses even had mechanical skeletons and ghosts that sat up and waved. Isn't this great? Danny gushed. No, Max said, looking around furtively. Why are you looking around like that? Danny asked. I'm worried someone will recognize me, Max said. If you'd worn a real costume, nobody would recognize you, Danny said. Hey, you want to try that house? She pointed at an old gray house near a bus stop. On its porch, a dozen jack-o'-lanterns flickered. Why not? Max said with a shrug. As they went up the walk, Danny pulled a second candy sack out of the one she was carrying and handed it to Max. Here. Forget it, Max said. I don't want any candy. That's what you say now, Danny said as she rang the doorbell, but when we get home, you'll start eating all my good stuff. All right. Max took the sack. The door swung open and an older man dressed in black with horns and a tail stood before them. Weird horror movie music was playing in the background. Abandon all hope, ye who ring my doorbell, the man cried. Max rolled his eyes. I guess you're supposed to be the devil? Trick or treat, said Danny. The devil rubbed his hands together. Well, well, what have we here? A little witch and a kid wearing sunglasses. I'm a psychotic teenager, Max said. The devil gave them candy, and they continued to the next house. Before long, their candy sacks started to get heavy, but Max was still bummed out. Can't you lighten up, Max? Danny asked as they worked their way down another block. You want me to lighten up? Max asked. Let's go home. Not yet, Danny said. They turned a corner. Up ahead, a bunch of kids were gathered under a streetlight, smoking and talking. Max froze. He just recognized Jay and Ernie.